Next
All
item.
right, special reports. A, state accountability, focus, reward, and priority. Dr. Maleko, Dr. Yusuf Masalam, Dr. Dan Patterson, and Ms. Fatmi Faraj.
Good evening.
Good evening.
This is Board President, Mr. Assad, and Dr. Maleko, Board of Education. So the team and I are up here this evening to discuss the accountability system here in Michigan and the history of it, timeline, and just to give some background information, where we were, where we're going, where we are currently.
Good.
So with the accountability system, since 2001, No Child Left Behind was put into action. And when No Child Left Behind was put into action, the idea was that the focus was on proficiency, that all students would score 100% proficient by a certain time frame. And as time went on, the focus started to move more towards gap analysis, to go from looking at adequate yearly progress to identifying what are the gaps that students are having. And usually those gaps are within our subgroup populations, and how can we close those gaps? So in 2009, the Race to the Top legislation was implemented. And that focus now went from less on proficiency, but more in terms of, are the gaps being closed between all students? And the emphasis went from adequate yearly progress to progress of individual students. How are the individual students doing in the school in comparison to other students across the state or the nation? In that process, there was also more of an emphasis on, teacher evaluation and teacher preparation. So it went from a broad scale to the scale narrowed down. In 2015, under the ESSA Act, Every Student Succeeds Act, the focus then narrowed even further down on gap analysis. But then throughout this process from 2010 to 2015, the state of Michigan established the top to bottom list, where we had schools that were identified as either priority school, focus school, or reward school. And then you had a group of schools in the middle that were not classified either way. And the focus on that was, through this top to bottom list, was through the top to bottom designation, you would identify which students and which subgroups had the largest gap comparison to other students. So with that, they formulated a bell curve. Your bottom 10% schools were considered your priority schools. Your bottom 30% schools beyond that 10% were considered your focus schools. And then you had your top 10% schools were your reward schools. In between, those were schools that were hitting the marks moving forward. The crucial element that the Every Student Succeeds Act changed in representation to Race to the Top and No Child Left Behind is it gave the states, or has given the states, much more flexibility in identifying their accountability standards as well as the measurements that they can use for those standards. With that flexibility, one of the changes that came into place with the Every Student Succeeds Act and the state of Michigan has adopted was, instead of looking at progress every year and looking at progress where one third grade, for example, was compared to the next year's third grade, the emphasis more went to student individualized scores, and then also looking at overall 2 years. So you had 2 years of data to identify where schools were going and how those schools were closing the gap. Through that process, we are currently still, waiting for where things are going to go moving forward, being that the ESSA legislation came into play in 2015. There are still some elements that the states are working through to identify where the accountability system is to continue moving. We as a district, our focus has always been to identify how we can use our different programs and departmental levels to identify and to have a holistic, consistent, and systematic process to support student achievement. And this is, that systematic process is identifying and using our title-funded monies with our school improvement process, through our strategic plan, to constantly look at every student in the district and how well they're doing in a relative understanding of how those students correlate with one another. So that's just the brief overview. And one other thing I wanted to leave off with as well is, since 2001, we have changes in the assessment system itself. We went from MEP to ACT and work keys and ALPA. ALPA was the English Language Proficiency Assessment. To now we have the MSTEP, the SAT, pre-SAT. We still have work keys, and now we have the WIDA and the WIDA is a different assessment that took the place of the English language proficiency assessment. So with the changes in the assessment, with the changes in the accountability systems, we're always trying to stay one step ahead so that we can understand, where we need to go as a district. But I will assure you that the one thing that we're always doing is no matter what the accountability system is or what the assessments are that we're going to use, we're always trying to narrow down where each of our individual students are and how to build up from that process. So with that said, I'd like to turn it over to the team, Dr. Pattison, who will discuss further the assessment process and the accountability systems.
Yeah. Okay, good evening, President Bazzi, Dr. Maleko, and board trustees. The school scorecards have been available for around a month now, and I know that all of you have had a chance to review those, and they're available to the public. So tonight we're not going to take a look at the district or school results. What I'd like to do is just go through what's on the scorecard, how they're calculated, just so we understand how to interpret those results, because they are a public way that our schools are evaluated. And as Dr. Masalam has mentioned, we're transitioning our assessment system and accountability system, and the scorecards as they were calculated this year will not be the same way that we have them calculated next year with our new accountability system, but I think it's still important for us to understand what is on them and how to interpret them. So in the scorecard, a district is given a color rating based on points that they earn. And each school is given a color rating plus 2 state rankings. And so what I'm going to do is show you, this is what the dashboard would look like for a school that would be logging in to take a look at their scorecard. So in this particular example, the school earned a rating of yellow. And that's because they earned 64% of their points based on the total number of points that they could earn. And you'll see that there's a scoring system on the bottom which would earn them that yellow rating. And then on the right, there's 2 percentiles on how the school ranks in the state. Both of them place them at about the middle of the state ranking. One is an overall achievement ranking, and then the other one is a ranking based on their achievement gap. So what I'd like to do is just kind of walk everyone through how each of these components is calculated, just so we can understand how the schools are evaluated. So as Dr. Masalam has mentioned, we've attempted to move from a single indicator, which is basically test scores, to multiple measures. And so what I have here is a list of all of the areas that schools are rated on in the school report card. You'll notice that assessment still makes up several of those portions. We have assessment participation, assessment proficiency, and assessment growth. Included in that with high schools, we have graduation rate. We also include attendance. And then there's also educator evaluations and other compliance factors. Now, with many of these indicators, we also take a look at not just the overall achievement, but also the achievement of subgroups as well. Our English learners, students with disabilities, are economically disadvantaged, as well as different ethnicities within the district. So these are all the areas that schools are rated and earn points on within the scorecard. A few things I'd just like to mention in terms of these different components. Assessment participation, really most schools, like all the schools in our district and most schools across the state, do not really struggle with that. We're required to test 95% of our students. Really everyone makes that mark. In terms of attendance, all of our schools meet that. Educator evaluations is really, did we meet the law in terms of how we do evaluations, and did we turn them in time? And in terms of the other compliance factors, it's a matter, did we turn in paperwork at a certain time? And most schools meet all of those additional indicators. So really where a lot of the variation is still comes down to assessments and differences in assessment scores. So that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over in terms of the calculations. So on the next slide, I have a picture in green and red of a sample scorecard with just the assessment components that a school would see. And so this shows you a few of the different areas that a school would be rated in terms of some points. So in this case, the top row, which is all green, would mean that that school met all of their proficiency targets in math, language arts, science, and social studies. The next row, which is labeled bottom 30%, This school earned red in all of those, which means that their lowest 30% of performing students did not meet their proficiency targets in any of those subjects. And then below that are the different subgroups that this school would have a large enough number of to also have significant and be counted towards its report card, which is why the points are different based on different schools. And so in this case, this school, their other subgroups met all of those, and that's why it's green. Okay. So what I'd like to do is just go through how these green points are earned, and in this example, why that bottom 30% would be all red for a sample school. So on the next slide, before we get into those calculations, I just want to review a few key terms related to assessment, because these are very important for how schools are evaluated. So the first is this notion of margin of error. So whenever we assess a student, it's never a 100% precise measurement of that student's ability. There's always some level of error in it. And so what I have is actually two pictures that I took from student scores that show how they receive their scores back from the state. The number on the top, which you can see the top number is 1,298, that's actually their score on the test. So this particular score, which is an M-STEP test in elementary, the scores range from around 1,000 to 2,000. And you'll see that that black line falls in the yellow region, which means that this student would be nearly proficient. Green and blue would be where we would count students as proficient and advanced, and under the No Child Left Behind era, that's where we want all students to be. That's where we like them now, but that's where the only way a student could meet that requirement was being in that green or blue. So if you notice that both of those bars have the black line within the yellow region. So in both of these assessments, the student would be counted nearly proficient. The gray bar around that black bar is where that student's score would most likely fall if they took the assessment again. And there's actually a 68% chance that that's where the student would fall if they took that assessment again. One other thing I'd just like to point out for you, just because I know assessments keep changing, is do you notice on the bottom score that gray bar is much wider? The top bar is actually from a M-STEP language arts assessment, and the bottom one is from a social studies assessment. The computer adaptive test on top, one of the benefits of those computer adaptive assessments is that the error is much smaller than on a fixed form assessment. So the older assessments that we gave that were fixed forms with multiple choice, those had much larger error. Now, because the state recognizes that there's some error in these measurements, what they do to actually calculate what we call provisionally proficient is they'll actually double that error measurement, and any student that is within two of those errors can actually be called proficient and be called provisionally proficient. So that will come into the calculation next. So you can see that there's kind of a wide range based on how that student scored. And then the other notion that's important is this notion of growth. And the state uses something called student growth percentiles. And I have an attachment that I'll give to all of you that kind of explains that. But essentially what it's doing is taking a look at a student compared to similar students from the year before and how they grew compared to their peers on that test. So in this case, if a student scored at that 1,298 level, the following year they would compare them to all the other students that had scored at 1,298 to see how well they did. Okay? So what I'd like to do now is let's take a look at a sample school and see how those scorecard points are earned. So on the next slide, I'd like to go over and take a look at how we calculate the proficiency of all of our students. So in the sample school, we're just going to say that we have 10 students, and that the proficiency target is they need to have 70% of their students proficient. And that's where I have that dotted line drawn. Now, in the fall, when we report back our test scores, let's say that this school had 50% of their students proficient. So you can see the half of them are green and the other half are red. So you can see that that's not at the 70% mark. When the state releases scores in the fall, this is the number that all of you saw back in September and October that's publicly released for all schools. The report card, though, actually use an additional calculation for this. So if students are within 2 of those standard errors of being proficient, we will count those students as being what we call provisionally proficient. So in the case of this example, let's say that 2 students were provisionally proficient. They weren't proficient, but they were close enough to where we would count them. Now, with the remaining 3 students, they weren't close enough to be in that range of proficiency, but let's say that one of them actually grew enough on the assessment to where they made enough growth compared to their peers that we would call them growth proficient. So in this case, if I label one other student growth proficiency, we can see that this school would meet their mark and earn the 2 points, which would allow them green on that top bar. And if you took a look at that example, most of the schools in our district met that mark. Okay? So that's how we make that calculation for the overall scorecard. Now, for the bottom 30%, which you saw in that example was red for that school, has a similar calculation. So in the next slide, I have the same school, 10 students. And if you remember how that school looked in terms of the distribution of proficient, provisionally proficient, and the growth proficient, what we do for the bottom 30 calculation is we actually ignore all of the other students other than the bottom 3 in this case. And this group, like all other subgroups, actually has the same proficiency target. So these 3 students also need to have 70% proficiency to meet that bottom 30 proficiency goal. So in the case of this picture, those 2 out of 3 students, we would really need to have 2 out of 3 of them, which would be about 67%, to be able to meet that bar. So here in this case, you can see that because none of them were very close to that proficiency bar and only one met the growth, that's why that school would earn mostly red in that category. And one thing I'd just like to point out in terms of how that growth percentile is calculated, which makes this kind of challenging for schools with diverse populations, is for a student to meet enough growth, they need to perform better than 60% of their peers. So what that means is that 60% of the students in the state are not going to meet adequate growth just based on the definition of it. So when you have students that are all at the low end and not proficient, most of those are also not going to make that proficiency growth as well because that's how the state has defined it. So in this is a case, this is where many schools did not meet the target and earned 0 based on the scorecard. All right, and then what I'd like to do is just briefly explain how we also calculate the school rankings. So in this case, what we do is we take a look at all the scores that are of all the students within the school. For elementary and middle, we take a look at the M-STEP scores, so math, language arts, social studies, and science. For the high school, we take a look at SAT for math and language arts, and then M-STEP science and social studies, and we also include the graduation rate. And what the state does is it's a complicated formula where they actually take all of these, put them into a formula, and try to standardize all of the test scores, add them up, and then weight them to come up with this composite number that represents student achievement across all of those measures. Once they do that and come up with this consistent rating among all schools based on those assessments plus graduation rates, then they rank schools based on that ranking. So with percentiles, if we take a look at all the schools in the state, 0th percentile would be lower achievement on state assessments, where at the higher percentile it would be higher achievement on state assessments. All right, so that's based on a combination of all the test scores added up, weighted, and put onto this uniform scale. The other ranking that schools get is an achievement gap ranking. And in this case, the ranking is calculated by taking the top 30% of your performing students and the bottom 30% of your performing students. We take a look at the average achievement of those 2 groups and look at the difference between them. So this wouldn't be an example for state assessments, but if you think about a classroom assessment that you might have taken, let's say that in the classroom, the top performing students earned an 80% and the lower performing students earned a 50%. That would be a 30-point achievement gap. So they would take a look at that difference between those 2 scores, and again, that is put on a uniform scale across all the schools in the state, and the lower percentiles would be schools with a very small gap, and the higher percentiles, or sorry, I said that backwards. The higher percentile would be a very small gap, and the lower percentiles would be a large gap. And one thing I'd like to point out, the reason we shouldn't just look at achievement gap as the overall indicator is a small gap can occur when you have all high-performing students, and it can also occur when you have very uniform low achieving students as well. So that achievement gap has to be looked at with other indicators as well. So a small gap are schools that were ranked high in that list, and a large gap would be schools that are ranked lower on that list. Okay. And then this is a slide I think I've had in every presentation for the last 5 years. Accountability is changing, like we've mentioned, and it is important for us to understand how these calculations are made. Schooling is a very complicated process. Running a district, whether it's 30 students or 20,000 students, is very complicated. So whenever we try to codify that and put it into a set of rules, we're obviously going to lose some of the nuances that happen in schools. So it's very important that we understand how all of this works together to understand how to interpret these appropriately. Just to give you a few examples, in No Child Left Behind, we're all aware that students had to be proficient to be counted towards making that progress towards 100% proficiency. But what that had, the unintended effect of that was that many schools saw students that were very close to that proficiency goal and tried to help those get over the bar to make their numbers look better. And so we ended up identifying students that we called bubble students. So you'll notice that in this present accountability system, many of the slides have the bottom 30% on it. Again, not all schools have just 30% of their students in need. In fact, across the nation right now, over 50% of our students are in poverty, and that's not equally distributed. So although that's one way to try to look at the achievement gap, we need to understand that that's not necessarily the only students that are meant to be focused upon. And so it's important that we interpret all of those in light of that. So what I'm going to do is I'll turn this over to my colleague, Ms. Faraj, and she's going to talk about our internal accountability system.
Good evening, President Pazzi, Dr. Maleko, and board trustees. So as we heard in the presentation, the scorecard and the state accountability are not the only measures that we use in the school buildings to make sure that we're looking at student achievement and making sure that every student succeeds. Dearborn Public Schools has adopted an internal accountability system, I would say since 2006. And ever since, this accountability system has been improving based on our observations and feedback from administrators, teachers, and support staff over the years. The internal accountability system that's in place is called the school improvement process. Many of you heard about the process. We presented about the process in the fall. And today we're going to go on to the next steps on what we do after we collect feedback from the schools. The school improvement process is relevant to the strategic plan. The school improvement plans within every single building aligns well with the strategic plan of the district, basing their goals on the same goals that the district is working on. In addition to the district's strategic plan, we make sure that our school improvement plans in the building also align with the state accountability. As Dr. Maleko and Dr. Musallam mentioned, we do welcome state accountability, and we do look at the numbers. We look at how they normalize their scores, and we take these measures into the schools and into the classrooms, and we analyze them. In addition to that, we use many other measures. We do not depend only on the standardized measures. So our internal accountability system includes a tool that we have developed, and we developed that tool collaboratively on the district level. And we make sure that this tool includes strategies and initiatives that are research-based and are proven to have high impact on student achievement. I have presented on the rubric in the fall, which is the tool, and we talked about the school improvement plan strategies, which were the initiatives in the strategic plan. For example, we had the content and language objectives that need to be on the board for every subject every day by every classroom teacher. We talked about questioning techniques, adequate response time when the teacher is asking questions, checking for understanding, how does the teacher check for understanding, the student engagement, and the digital tools. On the other hand, you will see the district initiatives that are in the strategic plan. So when we did walk the classrooms in the fall to every single building, every single classroom in the district, and that was over 900 classrooms or 970 classrooms, we have found that questioning techniques, and this is again an example of using different measures, formative assessment that would truly lead our next steps in the buildings. So questioning techniques is in red. That turned out to be one of our high need areas or areas of focus. Following that was the adequate response time and digital tools. How we came up with these specific focus areas is we took all the schools that we have visited. Observers included principals, superintendent, cabinet members, executive directors. In certain cases, it was board members as well, and community members. And what we did, we utilized the same tools so that we would be more objective about how we're looking at the implementation of these strategies. This graph represents all the strategies on the rubric and how the district overall distribution of implementation level. As I mentioned on the previous slide, questioning techniques, using digital tools, and response time were the highest need areas in the district. Further analysis of the results we collected from the fall visits indicated that certain strategies were not necessarily the focus strategies for all three feeders. We know that we have Dearborn feeder, Etzelford, and Dearborn, Etzelford, and Fordson. They were slightly different. So what would happen is during professional development, those three feeders would focus specifically on the areas needing additional focus. So this is Fordson. And for Fordson, it was questioning techniques and digital tools. For Dearborn High, it was questioning techniques, content, and language. And for Etzel, I believe it was questioning techniques and also digital tools. So again, when teachers and principals are meeting, they would go over the data analysis and they would determine next steps based on the formative assessment. Again, when we do visit a school, we visit all classrooms, including art, music, and gym, and even special area classrooms, and we monitor the implementation of these strategies. The strategies we selected are applicable to any classroom and any subject in the district. The SIP rubric is attached. We went over that in the fall, and also we have invited teachers to participate in the process so they would see other classrooms and learn from other classrooms. SIP protocol for the second semester, which is winter 2017, is unannounced. We announced it in the fall. Schools prepared themselves. They set the scene for us to come and look at data. And as I mentioned, we use multiple measures, not only the state accountability. So they presented their NWEA scores, their DRA scores, their demographics, how their bottom 30% of the students are performing, and all of these areas. In addition to that, they have presented their parental engagement programs and other initiatives that they have in the building. For this semester, we're doing unannounced visits. We finished our first two successfully on Friday. And again, we'd like to invite any board member or trustee who would like to participate in these. We welcome you.
Thank you.
Questions?
Trustee Petkoff?
One of the questions I have, and I don't know if it would be for this team or Dr. Maleko, as we have been encountering some change in administration in some of these buildings, with principals especially, who are the leaders who set the stage, so to speak, for these school improvement plans. When you go in for the announced one in the fall and or any other time when you have a changeover of administrators, how challenging is that then for them to have their team ready to know what they should be preparing for and what kind of information they need to be presenting for you to make a good, judgment.
Sure. So I think, obviously everybody's getting used to, when you get into a new building, it is kind of a learning curve for anyone.
Yeah.
Relationships, knowing your students. Every school is unique. But the nice thing with our district is we do have this uniform plan across the district. And that's why we've really invested in the intern program and all the positive, implementation that they have and the things they do, because we actually have an orientation where everybody from central office, including Ms. Farage and Dr. Patterson, will meet with them and go over that one-on-one when there's a new administrator in the building. And so there's kind of that transition process. And I'd say, also through all the principal meetings. So if someone comes in new, I guess it depends. If they're reassigned to a building, it might just be getting used to that building, but they already know the district initiatives because they're with me on a regular basis and they're implementing it. We every meeting, we're looking at the strategic plan. We have different breakout sessions that the principals attend. And then we have other opportunities, and Ms. Farage maybe can speak to. She's in charge of the leadership development in the Teacher Academy. And in there we have assistant principals getting training as well. We call it AP Leadership Academy. And so some of those topics come before them. And then I'd also say with the intern, that's why we're really moving on the intern program, because we feel like we do have a lot of interest. And so we want to have people ready to take that next step. And so by training them in those areas, they do dig into the data. I will say, though, that we also want them to focus on instruction. So having Dr. Patterson do the things that he does, and I've heard nothing but positive of the data sets that he brings to principals. We've heard it across the district since he came on board, because it saves them time and usefulness. And in fact, I was just at Howard today, elementary, when he was presenting to the staff on the different depth of knowledge and assessment data. So I think we can always look to improve that. But overall, because I think the strength of our cohesiveness with the strategic plan in our district, we're united. Having said that, every school does have, and I know you were at the school improvement with Oakman, so their data sets would be a little different. So that's where you've got the uniqueness of those schools. But as far as this year with the school improvement process, I think it was a really good move. It was recommended by the committee, and we moved on the same rubric. What we used to do for years is we did not have a similar rubric. We had different what we call look-fors, and it was based specifically on their plan. Now we've taken a district initiatives based on the strategic plan. So I don't know if any of you want to add to that, but...
One of my responsibilities is to coach new principals and second and third year principals. And I do hold almost weekly sessions with the principals, and we set a goal on what we're going to work on. The first semester was mainly school improvement process and data analysis. We would take the graphs and the charts that Dr. Patterson generates, and we would go over these and figure out the way to analyze them and interpret the data with the staff. I've also done that through staff meetings and entire staff sessions where we looked at the data and analyzed it in addition to the school improvement protocol and other strategies. So that's the other half of my job.
Yeah, I guess I was kind of, in my mind, I was thinking like about Dearborn High, which got a new principal, and we had some, so people coming in from outside of the district who might not be familiar with what we're doing and where we're starting at, and also are taking on the challenge of not only a new building, but maybe grade levels and different assessments than they're familiar with. How do we help them make sure that we don't lose ground with what's been happening in those buildings when that kind of turnover occurs?
Well, one of the things there, again, we have the support from central office that will come in, our EL director and that. But when we did we also brought in someone that's been in our district for a long time, Mr. Breel, right, who was heavily engaged in the Etzel Ford School improvement process with the institutional knowledge and obviously the great work that went on there. So we were setting Mr. Martin up for, we knew he was going to be new to the district, so we had some individuals that had been heavily involved in school improvement process and had actually had success as she worked with Mr. Casebold over at Etzel. We had Mr. Deere that came from Bryant, and then so it was kind of a balance. But I would also say that there's heavy involvement from, it would be Ms. Peterson, the executive director, overseeing, and then it would be the central office team. I think that's one of the strengths of our district as well, that, a lot of districts, because of the size we're at, we're a decent size. We're not too large, but we're large enough to kind of pool our resources.
enough, right.
And the thing is that we have, Ms. Al-Dubaili, you probably see in board briefs all the time, these visitors coming from this district, not only in state, but out of state, and they're coming to see the initiatives that are going on in Dearborn from both a curriculum aspect and from, whether it be English language learners and other programs. And we, so I'd say it's because of the support in the learning community. And I feel that, I know this because I've been here and seeing that they feel comfortable going to central office. And when not, we send them out there. And that's why we're in the buildings. So for me as superintendent, I'm there with the committee, and we go through every school, and then we provide support. When we do a school improvement, we're not looking to do what the state's doing with the summative. We have to acknowledge the state summative, the M-STEP, and we welcome the accountability. We do. But this is another measure where we're looking, we call it internal, because we're trying to share in the knowledge to truly improve. And actually, most of the research shows in the field that the internal accountability of working together in learning communities, which we know from Etzel, is actually going to be much more effective than any external measure. Having said that, we welcome the external measures, but we know that through our school improvement process, implementing effective strategies, some of the ones that were on the board, that's really where you're going to have your greatest gain. So I guess the overall answer is that we're going to just provide continual support. But at the same token, we know we have improvements to make, and we welcome that, and we will. And every school is at a little different level. So, we appreciate the work of the teams, but I think Mr. Casebolt in particular, he's presenting right now on learning communities at all our general administrators meeting. And we're going to have it's being planned, and I've put it in board briefs, we're going to have an administrative retreat for all administrators focused around learning communities and the strategic plan. It's going to channel into the teachers. So everybody is kind of hearing the same thing. And what he said to me is, I can really see the cohesiveness of how it's coming together. And you had multiple administrators presenting there, not just him. And actually one of them was Lori Lintner, who actually works as an administrator at Dearborn High. So you have administrators from different aspects of the district working together. And then the next step, what we're looking to do is to bring in examples from schools. So like we have a high school example, Etzel, but now we want to bring in an elementary example of learning communities. And so that's the sharing of the knowledge. And the positive is that we have administrators from different schools and teachers sitting on those committees. So if you're a teacher, or an administrator, you may be teaching at Bryant, but you're going to Dearborn High or you're going to Fortson to share in that knowledge. So I think that bringing the teachers in for me was one of the biggest positive moves I think we made. I just wish there was a way for me to get more teachers there because of the sub situation and things like that.
Yeah.
So.
Trustee Hamid?
Well, first of all, I had an opportunity to walk through a SIP visit, and I know so did Trustee Kratlichkov. And I just wanted to share with the public the detail that goes into eventually this rubric that you have created. And first you start to realize that every school is unique, which is nice why we have this process. And every school does have different needs, especially sometimes, depending on where they live and so on. And that's very important to take into consideration to make sure that those needs are met. But the process is when we were going through actually each individual classroom, and I had an opportunity to walk through with Glenn, I felt like I was walking with a detective, literally, who was walking into classrooms, looking through folders, checking what's on the wall, and making sure that the students can answer questions, where could you find this, even in terms of instructional things or what they've learned, or how to use certain technology. So that's the amount of detail that goes into this process, and it truly is something that it should be commended, and I commend all of you for your work on this. And I'm really interested to see, now with this new unannounced visit, which I think is much more organic, to kind of compare. Because when we went, it was great, but you still feel like everybody is extra prepared. They want to show you the best, which is great, and there's something really nice about that. But I'm also interested to see the data that's going to come back when the visits are unannounced. So,
Trustee Thorpe?
And I had a chance to go to one of those unannounced visits on Friday, and it was my first time doing one of these. One of the things that I noticed was everybody was speaking the same language. They know what they were looking for, and they were able to take it from building to building, I feel, and be able to still be looking for the same things, even though every single building is going to be unique.
Right.
And also, again, there was peers there, so you know that they're talking and they're watching what's going on in the other buildings.
Right.
What's working well there, we should try to adopt it in our building.
Trustee Barry?
I know we do amazing things in our schools, but, and this was a great presentation, thank you. But it is what it is. The external measures are in the public, they're out in the newspaper, and I'm sure we all field phone calls. My question, it goes to anybody here who can answer it, is how can I look at 2 or 3 schools within a 2-mile radius and see numbers all over the place without pegging any school, one school to another? What do you feel as educators is the difference? I don't want to give examples. If I give examples, I'm pegging one building against another. Let's just concentrate on, like, on the elementary schools. What could it possibly be?
One of the things that we're trying to do more of, and we're continuously growing with this school improvement process, with the unannounced visit and the announced visits, is looking for systemic. Are we systemic, and are we continuous in our processes to identify in every individual building where their needs are and how are we addressing those needs? And with this process, you will see at times that you have certain areas where there's a change in demographic or there's a change in cohort and there's certain needs that need to be addressed, that through the school improvement process, we can systematically address those needs and say, as a team, here are the needs that we're seeing with the data being presented, the data from the external assessments, as well as the data that we're identifying through the SIP process. And then we as a team, what we need to do and what we need to work on with each individual school is how can we be of assistance, and through the PLC process that Dr. Maleko mentioned, what is happening in a school that has similar demographics with you, that has adjusted to the needs of those students, that you can address and build off of. And what we're noticing is with the changes in the accountability system and the changes with the assessment processes, we have to adapt faster than those changes are being made, and we need to always stay one step ahead. And through this school improvement process and with the unannounced visits, we are confident that that's going to allow us to do that. And working with the special population groups as well, special education, English language learners, students that are at need, at risk due to poverty or so be it, identifying what works, how does it work, and are we emulating that in areas that need that? So can there be pockets where there needs to be adjustments? Definitely. But our goal is to limit those pockets and to reduce those pockets and to support. And with what we are doing thus far, especially with schools that have new administrators, by tying those schools together to support one another, schools that feed in with one another, that are near each other demographically, that helps, because now what we're doing more of, and Dr. Maleko mentioned it, is we're trying to get teachers to communicate more with each other as well. It's not just, we got to do this, how we can do it. It's getting those teachers in those professional learning communities sitting side by side, looking at that data together. Just today I had a conversation with some teachers over at Snow Elementary School. And then that conversation was, when you look at this NWEA data, when you look at this MSTEP data, ask this question: where do we need to go to support the students? And then let's speak to one another, not just within our school, not just our grade mates. And I will tell you, for example, Whitmore Bowles, Long Elementary, and Nowlin Elementary, we have those teachers coming together. Those conversations are becoming very powerful to help move and understand what can we do together to support every child. And we're going to continue moving with that.
Okay, since you walked into the hot seat, I'm going to dig a little deeper. I know with your, throughout your career, you served at different levels, so you're probably well equipped to answer this question. How much does parent involvement, teacher morale, the relationship between the teachers and the parents, the relationship between the teachers and the principal affect? I mean, I'm looking at, you mentioned the school, I would rather you don't, but I'm looking at schools here, it's like all over the place. How much, Mike, can you answer my question, please?
Do I have an official, scientific answer? I don't. But from my experiences, When teachers feel that what they're doing is being recognized and they're feeling supported, and that support is coming from all over, from their principal, from central office, from one another, and that parents are part of that process and that conversation, and there's an understanding that these scores are identifying the need of the child and how we can move forward to support that child, I believe the teacher morale goes up. And I believe that as long as the teachers are working towards student success and the focus on student needs, and that the support is there and the parents are well informed, I believe it has a positive impact. I'm sure there's research that identifies that as well. If the focus is not on student success, then it drives morale down for anyone. And we have to have that collaboration, that true PLC opportunity, that opportunity for Dr. Patterson to come in and explain what that data means. And then Mrs. Farage and Mrs. Aldo-Bailey and Mrs. Jager and others to come in and to support that process, us. And I feel that if parents and teachers feel supported, it helps with their morale. It helps push those students to the next level.
We have some amazing teachers in our district. Okay, we have to, and Dr. Malik and I just spoke about this, we have to let our educators do their, what they do best. And again, I'm looking, you can't see what I'm looking at here, but just from my experience, some of the top schools is where parent involvement is just unbelievable. No doubt in my mind. We've seen it. There's some changes with administration, and I think we've paid the price for that. I've seen it where you have again, I don't want to pin people against each other. You have a good administrator doing some great things at a school, then we move that administrator and get somebody else, and relationships between the administrator and the teacher is probably not the same. That kind of drives things down. Then the parents sense that, drive the parents away, and these numbers reflect that. So I guess I'll back off a little bit here to be continued. Let's keep an eye on that, please. I mean, teacher morale and parent involvement.
Sure.
If I can say a couple of things. I do appreciate that, and I also think it's important that we have some change. I know everyone was upset when Principal Farage left, but she's now doing great things for the entire district, and so I think change is good while keeping into consideration what's happening. I also think it's important that we don't freak out when we see a headline, for lack of a better term. I know that I was approached by certain people, and they're looking at some of these, and certainly we do need these external measures, but there's a larger story, and that's part of the reason I asked for this presentation today. And it's really a continuation of the presentation that was given back in November. And I think we need to understand that if parents don't know what's, when you see a headline, there doesn't need to be a head on the chopping block, which is kind of what I kind of felt people were looking for, and people were asking questions, even on social media, which I won't respond to anyone on social media. I think what you need to do is identify the problem and work together collaboratively, and I think that is also an important part of teacher morale. When teachers are okay to work with someone else and feel comfortable working with someone else because their success is their success, I think that's more important than them feeling that they have to be ranked higher than someone else in order to succeed. There's one other thing. I mean, I understand that with the external measures, we had a few schools that obviously got some designations we aren't happy with, and we certainly have lots of room for improvement. We're not there, but we're getting there. But I also know that there are a lot less schools now that have gotten those designations than did how many years ago?
Sure, we had at one point, as far as focus schools, we had 9 schools on the list, and we have 2. We have 1 we're disputing, and that's, if I can, since you kind of gave me the segue in, do you mind if I just expand a little? This is where we got to be careful right now, and that's we presented in November. We welcome the accountability. I got to tell you, a friend of Dearborn, Brian Weston, who's up at the state, I'm supportive of what he's trying to do with changing the state accountability system, because there are, and I'm just from a research aspect, and I've even talked to some different people at high levels, that, you know, right now there's no current confidence in the numbers you're getting, okay? Not just as far as the state numbers. And they recognize it, and so they're trying to make some changes. So, you know, again, we have to welcome it, but we got to, you know, look at the fact that it is this measure, and it's one of multiple measures. We again want to champion the accountability. So I'm hopeful that the new process that's being proposed will go through. It will mean another change. But as Dr. Patterson said, the problem that we've had is that any researcher or statistical person will tell you need at least 3 years of a stable measure before it can be considered reliable in the field.
We haven't had that.
And we haven't had that in 4 to 5 years. So, like, as Etzel was our example of, we went within, again, we're going to champion Etzel. We like the work they did great things. I mean, we're proud. And we could have said, look, we went from, the 0 to 29 to what they said initially was 75 within a couple of years, and then all of a sudden it got published at 45. So those are things we just got to watch, that anybody can come up with a number, but the question is what actually calculates it. And we saw Dr. Patterson, it's such a complicated measure because of all the different variables that the general public doesn't really understand. Now, I have a good understanding because that's where I focus my dissertation research, and I am passionate. And again, I want to preface it. We welcome the accountability. But we're going to look at school improvement with this measure, the state test, with our NDWA growth, and measuring, what you said with what's going on in the classroom with teachers, because that's a positive. So when you have positive parent involvement, it does show that you're going to have better results. There's also multiple strategies, and we could bring research into the field that show that you will increase. And that's why there's really the school improvement process that we feel proud of. But again, we welcome that accountability, and we're going to continue to work with it. And this is the reality. This is the law that we're facing. And I think the researchers up there even know that, one of the things I've heard Brian Wilson say is change it, but don't change it again for another decade. Like, we need some consistency. So I also want to mention something for the teachers, is that when we go in school improvement, we're not evaluating teachers. And that's why I want the teachers to know, brought up the teachers, that it's a multiple measures, and that's because we're not going to just measure a teacher based on one thing. We're measuring the success of our students and how they're doing. And you can't measure everything by this accountability. There's things, I said it at the Teacher Appreciation Day, you can't measure that relationship with that teacher that the student has and the success they have later on. So again, these are all the positive things that I think come into play. And I know this has been a long presentation. I know it's also important. But those are kind of, my areas that I feel are critical. And I think, you let me segue in here, and I appreciate Trustee Berry bringing up some of the things in President Bazzi. And they're all good points. And so we're going to continue. We have a competent team. We're going to continue to work. We're going to get into schools. We're going to look at the measures. We're going to look at our NWA growth data, and we're going to make sure that we challenge. And that's what you would have saw in the school improvement. We're going to continue to look for improvement. I know Trustee Fadwa has been in there, Trustee Petlichkoff, and if you see that, we are very prescriptive. I think when you said the detective, it's because we're prescriptive in what we're doing for trying to enhance improvement.
Right.
And so
that's
that's
exactly
really
what
So I'm going to preface it that way, is that we welcome the accountability. We also hope that the SAFE improves the system, because right now the system is not the most optimal system. And so I'm not confident from a statistical reliability in all the numbers. I'm being frank on that. But they are still the numbers, and they're one measure, so we're going to look at them just like we're going to look at the other measures. And then once the state really does get that system in place, it's going to be probably looked at even more emphasis within those data sets. So I think your message, I gave you the long answer, was be careful with that measure, but welcome what we're doing, and just there's other things behind it. And I think he tried to simplify that presentation too, and I think he did a great job, but it's very complicated.
And I think to what Trustee Berry is alluding to is the community at large tends to take a look at these numbers, and they make a judgment call upon a district's strengths and weaknesses and success, and they also use that as a variable as to whether the community itself is successful or not, and one that they would be interested in being a resident of and moving their families to. And I guess we have said this over and over again as board members for many years, is that if you're really interested in a school district that you and a community that you're looking to move to or using any form of measurement, you need to take this with a great deal of caution and get in there and actually visit the schools and have a conversation with people who live in the community and get onto the websites and look at what's going on before you use one newspaper headline as your determinant for the success or weakness of a community. Because we know for a fact that many people have made a decision about who Dearborn is, what we have to offer in a variety of ways. And it's not an accurate assessment of what this community is about. So we have to continue to stress to people, you really need to come and see before you make a judgment call, and by using just a number published in a paper. It's not the whole answer.
Trustee Barry?
Dr. Maleko, I don't know what you meant by we have to be careful here. I'm not questioning the team. They did a wonderful job. And Dr. Patterson, I've spent many, many hours trying to figure this out. In 10, 15 minutes, I just got educated, to be honest with you. Good job. But it is what it is. I mean, I'm on my third round of people telling me, don't pay attention to these numbers. There's something good coming up. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, the headlines are there. And it does reflect on the city of Dearborn. It does reflect on Dearborn Public Schools. So when I have to answer to people, I sell Dearborn. I'm out there selling Dearborn. Every day I have to answer to Dearborn. When I look at this, I think 5 years ago I was told the same thing, and back in '09 I was told the same thing. Don't pay attention to the current measurements. We got something coming. So it does get frustrating a little bit. But I'm not questioning the teachers. I'm not questioning the team. I'm not questioning you. I'm not questioning us. We live in one of the greatest cities in the world, and Dearborn Public Schools is a big part of that. Thank you.
Dr. Mead?
Hi. What a great presentation on a very, very important topic. One of the things that I loved about the presentation and what you said earlier is that everybody's following the strategic plan and the SMART goals. And I think that's our job as the board, is to make sure that everybody is following the strategic plan. And another thing I want to talk about is your presentation, Doctor. What are the chances of getting that in writing?
Whatever you'd like, we can do for you.
I know you don't have anything to do, but this is going to keep evolving. The ESSA is now, where is it going to go? Nobody knows for sure. But one of the themes for the ESSA is that we're moving more to the individual. Everything we've been talking about is the buildings. And that's what we've been discussing, the impact of that information on buildings. But we really need the impact of this information on the individual student. So my question to you is, are we to the point where we can actually do an educational plan for each student based on all of this data, that we have some idea where they possibly could be in the process of being educated? And do we have a plan then for each student to move them forward? Because I think ESSA is more interested in what progress is the student making. If they're only reading at the first grade level and they're in the third grade, and the next year if they get to the second grade reading level, that's progress. So that's my question.
Well, right now as a district, we've been doing it for a couple of years and we're getting better at it. Each student establishing a My Learning Plan, where they identify where their strengths are, where they need to grow, and of course at each level it looks a little different, and we're continuously growing upon that. I do know that one of our focus areas in elementary, and as we continue moving forward, is our system of conferring, where there's actual conversations, and actually I think I'm going to be doing somewhat of a presentation on this in the future, where we have with the metacognitive aspect of student engagement, where they think about their own thinking and looking at where they are and what they need to do and how we can help them get to the next steps. So we are moving more towards the individualized instruction and support, and we are growing upon that. And one of the things that I know the team does when they go into a school is when they have the conversations with the school improvement team at that school, they do look at that data for the students and they identify which students need what, when, how, what are they getting, and what do we need to do next to support. So we are going deeper into that data and looking at the individual students, and we're continuously growing upon that process.
Do we have the resources to move these students forward? because ultimately that will be, the building statistics will be better.
Well, we currently use a lot of our federal funding, such as Title I, Title III, and Title II to support that. And then Dr. Maleko has been very open to looking at different options and scenarios wherein we can use whatever financial resources we have to support the schools with resources as needed. So that is always open for conversation.
Okay. So when you write this lovely little report, it would be something that if you could send to all of us, then you can just add to it as this progresses, because the ESSA will be having an impact on us for years. Thank
Yes, sir.
you.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great job.